It was one of those gray, damp mornings in Brooklyn that made New York feel like a stranger, even to someone who'd lived there her whole life. The streets buzzed with their usual chaos, yellow taxis honking sharp, impatient notes, the clatter of hurried footsteps on wet pavement, the low hum of voices swallowed by the wind. Maria stood behind the counter of her small bakery, a worn-out spot on a corner of Flatbush Avenue, where the smell of fresh croissants and bagels fought to hold its own against the cold seeping through the glass. She wiped her hands on her apron, the flour dusting her fingers like a faint ghost of the morning's work, and glanced out the window. People rushed by, heads down, collars up, chasing warmth or deadlines or both. Another day in the city that never slowed down. She didn't notice him at first. He was just a shape against the gray, a patch of gold that didn't belong. But then he moved, or maybe he didn't, and her eyes caught on him. A dog, sitting motionless in front of the bakery door. A golden retriever, or something close to it, though his fur was matted and streaked with dirt, clinging to a frame so thin she could see the faint outline of his ribs. He didn't belong here, not among the concrete and the noise. He looked like something lost, something left behind. And yet, there he was, staring straight ahead, as if he'd been waiting for hours. Maria tilted her head, frowning. Stray dogs weren't rare in New York, mangy shadows that darted through alleys or begged scraps near the deli on 7th Street. But this one was different. It wasn't just his thinness or the way his fur hung in clumps, damp from the drizzle. It was his eyes. Large, brown, and impossibly deep, they didn't just look at the world, they seemed to pull it in, reflecting not just the dim glow of the streetlights but something else, something older. She couldn't place it, but it made her chest tighten, a quick, sharp tug she brushed off as nothing. The bell above the door jingled as a customer stepped out, a man in a gray coat clutching a paper bag of bagels. He sidestepped the dog without a glance, muttering something about the weather. The dog didn't flinch. He didn't bark or lunge or even wag his tail. He just sat there, his gaze fixed on the bakery window on her. Maria felt it like a weight, those eyes pinning her in place. She shook her head and turned back to the tray of muffins she'd been arranging, shoving the feeling down. Just a dog. Just another stray. But he didn't leave. Minutes ticked by, 5, then 10, and every time she stole a glance, he was still there, a statue of quiet misery. Customers came and went, their chatter filling the small space with warmth. Mrs. Henderson complaining about her arthritis, a young guy in a hoodie ordering coffee to go. Some noticed the dog. An old woman paused, her gloved hand hovering over her purse, and murmured, "Poor thing. Reminds me of my Rusty, gone 10 years now." A kid tossed half a bagel into the trash and shot the dog a guilty look before hurrying off. But no one stopped. No one did anything. Life in New York rolled on, relentless, swallowing stories like his without a second thought. Maria tried to ignore him too. She swept crumbs from the counter, refilled the coffee pot, counted the change in the register. But every time she looked up, those eyes were there, waiting. Not begging, not demanding, just waiting. It was the stillness that got to her, the way he held himself with a kind of painful dignity, like he was too proud to ask but too broken to walk away. She didn't know why it bothered her so much. Maybe it was the cold, the way his thin body shivered in the damp air. Maybe it was the way he lifted a paw once, hesitant, as if he wanted to knock on the glass but couldn't bring himself to do it. By late afternoon, the drizzle had turned to a steady rain, drumming against the awning outside. The bakery was quiet now, the lunch rush long gone. Maria stepped out from behind the counter to toss a pile of stale bread into the bin by the door. She pushed it open, the bell jangling softly, and froze. He was still there. The golden dog stood up slowly, his movements careful, deliberate, like he didn't want to scare her. He didn't run toward the bread, didn't pounce. He just took a step closer, then another, until he was near enough that she could see the rain beating on his fur, could hear the faint rasp of his breath. She should have shooed him off. That's what she'd done with strays before, waved a broom, called out a sharp, "Go on," until they scampered away. But this time, she didn't. She couldn't. He looked up at her, those deep eyes catching the light in a way that made them shimmer, and for a second, she thought she saw something in them, not just the street, not just her reflection, but a flicker of something else. A yard, a child's laugh, a summer day long gone. It was gone as quick as it came, and she blinked, shaking her head. Too much coffee, she told herself. Then he moved. His paw reached out, slow and trembling, and brushed against her hand. It was cold, damp, the pads rough against her skin, but the touch stopped her cold. The city disappeared. The rain, the horns, the voices, all of it faded, leaving just her and him in a bubble of silence. She stared down at him, her breath catching, and felt something shift inside her, something heavy and old, like a door creaking open after years of being locked shut. "You're lost, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. He tilted his head, just slightly, as if he understood. He didn't pull away, didn't demand anything more. He just stood there, waiting, his eyes locked on hers. And in that moment, she knew he wasn't just a stray. He wasn't just lost. He was waiting for someone, for something for her. Maria didn't think. She stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Come on, boy," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. He hesitated, looking at her like he couldn't believe it, like he'd heard those words before and they'd turned out to be a lie. Then, slowly, he took a step forward, crossing the threshold from the cold, wet world into the warmth of the bakery. His paws left faint prints on the wooden floor, small drops of water scattering as he shook himself lightly. Maria grabbed a cloth and wiped them away, her hands moving on instinct while her mind raced. He padded to the corner near the counter and lay down, his thin body curling into itself. He was exhausted, that much was clear, but there was a calm in him now, a quiet relief. Maria set a bowl of water and a few pieces of bread in front of him, watching as he lapped at the water with slow, careful movements. She didn't know why she'd let him in. She didn't take in strays, didn't have time for messes she couldn't fix. But as she looked at him, at those eyes that seemed to carry a secret she couldn't name, she felt it again, that tug, that pull, like a thread tying her to something she'd lost long ago. Outside, the rain kept falling, blurring the world beyond the glass. Inside, the bakery felt different, smaller, warmer, stranger. Maria stood there, the cloth still in her hand, and wondered what she'd just let in. Not just a dog, she thought. Something more. The bakery hummed with its usual rhythm the next morning, but it didn't feel the same. The air was thick with the scent of yeast and coffee, the clatter of trays and the low chatter of customers filling the space, yet something hung beneath it all, a quiet shift Maria couldn't pin down. She moved through her tasks on autopilot, kneading dough, pouring cream into mugs, nodding at familiar faces. But her eyes kept drifting to the corner near the counter, where the golden dog lay curled up on an old blanket she'd tossed down last night. He hadn't moved much since then, just lifted his head now and then to watch her with those deep, unblinking eyes. Word had spread fast. By noon, the place was busier than usual, the bell above the door jingling nonstop. Regulars like Mrs. Henderson lingered longer, their glances sliding toward the dog with a mix of curiosity and pity. "He's a sweet one," she said, clutching her bag of rye bread. "Looks like he's been through hell, though." A guy in a delivery uniform dropped $1 into the tip jar and muttered, "Hope you're keeping him." Streets lead him alive. Even the kids who usually bolted out with their cookies stopped to stare, whispering to each other about the bakery dog. Maria forced a smile, brushing off the comments with a shrug. "We'll see," she said, over and over, until the words felt hollow. She didn't know what she was going to do with him. She hadn't planned on a dog, didn't have the space, the time, the heart for it. But every time she thought about shooing him out, those eyes stopped her. They weren't just watching her, they were searching, pulling at something buried deep inside her, something she'd spent years trying to forget. She caught herself staring back too long, losing track of orders, until a customer's cough snapped her out of it. It was late afternoon when things got strange. The bakery had emptied out, the last of the day's rush fading into the gray light filtering through the windows. Maria was wiping down the counter when she noticed the clock above the door, a cheap, battery-powered thing she bought years ago. It was stuck. The second hand twitched, hovering over the 6, refusing to move forward. She frowned, tapping the glass with her finger. Nothing. She glanced at the dog, half expecting him to be asleep, but he was sitting up now, his head tilted, staring at the clock too. His eyes caught the light, and for a split second, they shimmered, not with the usual amber glow, but with something else. A flicker of green grass, a child's shadow running across it, a bark echoing in the distance. Then it was gone. Maria blinked hard, her hand frozen mid-wipe. "What the hell?" she muttered, shaking her head. She looked back at the clock. The second hand ticked forward, steady as ever, like nothing had happened. Her pulse quickened, a cold prickle running down her spine. She turned to the dog, but he'd already lain back down, his gaze drifting to the floor. Just a trick of the light, she told herself. Just her imagination running wild. But it didn't stop there. That night, after locking up, she took him home. The walk to her apartment, a cramped second-floor rental a few blocks away, was quiet, the city's noise dulled by the fog rolling in off the river. He padded beside her, his step slow but sure, like he knew the way. She didn't put him on a leash. He didn't need one. He stayed close, his shoulder brushing her leg now and then, a silent promise he wouldn't run off. When they reached the building, she fumbled with her keys, the cold metal biting her fingers, and let him in first. He stepped inside like he'd been there before, sniffing the air once before settling near the couch. Maria grabbed a towel and a bowl of warm water, kneeling beside him to clean the worst of the dirt from his fur. He didn't resist, just lay there, his breathing soft and steady. As she worked, her fingers brushed something under his neck, a thin, jagged scar, barely visible beneath the matted gold. She paused, running her thumb over it. Too straight to be an accident. Too deep to be nothing. "What happened to you?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. He lifted his head, meeting her eyes, and she froze. There it was again, that shimmer, that flicker. This time, it was clearer, a rusted gate, a man's voice shouting, a collar pulled too tight. Her hand jerked back, the towel slipping to the floor. "Okay," she said, her voice shaky. "That's enough of that." She stood up fast, busying herself with making tea, anything to shake the unease creeping up her spine. But as the kettle whistled, she couldn't stop the memories it dragged up. A golden retriever named Max, her best friend when she was a kid growing up in Queens. The way he'd wait for her by the back door after school, his tail thumping against the linoleum. The way her father had hated him, called him a burden, a waste of money, until one day he wasn't there anymore. She'd come home, 10 years old and sunburned from summer, and the yard was empty. Her father wouldn't look at her when she asked where Max went. "Gone," was all he'd said, and that was that. She hadn't thought about Max in years. Not really. She boxed him up with the rest of her childhood, locked him away where he couldn't hurt her anymore. But now, sitting on her couch with a mug of tea she didn't drink, she couldn't shake the feeling that this dog, this stray with the scar and the eyes, was tied to him somehow. It was impossible. Max would be long dead by now, 20 years gone. And yet, she looked at him, sprawled out on the rug, and noticed something glinting in his fur. She set the mug down and knelt again, parting the damp strands until she found it, a small, tarnished medallion, tangled in the mess near his scar. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free, holding it up to the lamp. The edges were worn, the metal scratched, but there was a word etched into it, faint but unmistakable, Max. Her breath caught. "No," she said, barely a whisper. "No way." She turned it over, searching for more, a date, a clue, anything, but there was nothing else. Just that name, staring back at her like a ghost. She looked at the dog, her heart pounding. He stared back, calm and steady, and for a moment, she swore she heard it, a faint bark, echoing not in the room but in her head, sharp and bright like a summer day. That night, she dreamed. She was walking through Brooklyn, but the streets were wrong, empty, silent, the buildings leaning in like they were watching her. The dog was ahead, his golden fur glowing against the dark, leading her somewhere she couldn't name. She followed, her feet bare on the pavement, until they reached a park she hadn't seen in years. A swing creaked in the wind, a rusted gate groaned, and there he was, Max, her Max, chasing a ball she couldn't see. She reached for him, but he turned, and his eyes weren't a dog's anymore. They were endless, swirling with light and shadow, pulling her in until she couldn't breathe. She woke with a start, her chest heaving, the room dark and still. The clock on the nightstand blinked 3:17. She sat up, rubbing her face, and heard it, a soft scratch from the living room. She stumbled out of bed, her bare feet cold against the floor, and found him by the window. He was sitting there, staring out at the street, the yellow glow of the lamps pooling around him. His pole rested on the sill, and where it touched, the glass shimmered, not with frost, not with rain, but with something alive, a faint pulse of light that faded as she blinked. "Max," she said, her voice cracking. He turned to her, tilting his head just like he had in the dream, and she felt it again, that thread, that pull, tying her to something she couldn't outrun. "You're back, aren't you?" she whispered. He didn't move, didn't bark, just watched her with those eyes that held too much. And in the silence, she knew she was right. The next morning broke cold and sharp, the kind of day that bit at your knuckles and turned your breath to fog. Maria woke to the sound of scratching, soft, insistent, like a nail against wood. She rolled out of bed, still groggy, and found him by the living room door. The golden dog Max, she couldn't call him anything else now, sat there, his head tilted, his eyes fixed on her with a quiet urgency. He didn't paw at the door again, didn't whine. He just waited, like he had something to show her. "You want out?" she asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. He tilted his head further, a gesture so familiar it made her stomach twist. She grabbed her coat from the hook, the wool rough against her skin, and dug through a drawer for a length of rope she'd used to tie up trash bags. It wasn't much of a leash, but it'd do. She looped it around his neck, careful not to tug the scar she'd found last night, and opened the door. "All right, boy. Let's go." The street outside was alive with its usual chaos, taxis weaving through traffic, a delivery guy shouting into his phone, the low rumble of the subway beneath her feet. But as soon as Max stepped onto the sidewalk, something shifted. He didn't hesitate, didn't sniff the air or wander like a stray might. He started walking, his steps steady and purposeful, pulling her along like he knew exactly where he was going. Maria followed, the rope loose in her hand, her boots scuffing against the wet pavement. She tried to guess his path, maybe the deli, maybe the park a few blocks down, but he turned left when she expected right, then right when she thought left, leading her through a maze of streets she thought she knew. The city felt off. It wasn't just the fog, thick and heavy, curling around the lampposts like smoke. It was the way the noise seemed to fade when Max passed, the horns and voices dropping to a murmur, then snapping back when she caught up. She glanced at the people around her, bundled up figures hurrying through the gray, but they didn't look at him. Not really. A woman with a stroller veered around them without a word. A man in a suit brushed past like they weren't there. It was as if he was invisible to everyone but her. "Where are you taking me?" she muttered, half expecting an answer. He didn't turn, just kept moving, his golden fur a faint beacon in the haze. They crossed Flatbush Avenue, then dipped into a narrow alley she'd never noticed before, the walls tight and crumbling, the air smelling of rust and damp brick. She frowned, her grip tightening on the rope. This wasn't right. She'd lived in Brooklyn for years, walked these streets 1,000 times. There was no alley here, not one like this, anyway. But Max didn't slow, didn't falter, and she followed, her heart thudding against her ribs. The alley opened into a quiet street she didn't recognize, lined with sagging brownstones and skeletal trees. The fog thickened, swallowing the tops of the buildings, and the sounds of the city faded entirely. It was just them now, her boots on the pavement, his claws clicking softly, the rope swaying between them. He turned again, cutting through a vacant lot where weeds poked through cracked concrete, then stopped at a rusted gate. Beyond it lay a small park, tucked between two towering apartment blocks like an afterthought. The swings hung still, the benches weathered and splintered, a single twisted tree clawing at the sky. Maria stopped short, her breath catching. She knew this place. Not from Brooklyn, from Queens, from years ago. It was the park where she'd taken Max as a kid, where they'd spend hours chasing each other through the grass, hiding from the shouting at home. But that was miles away, a subway ride and a lifetime apart. She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "This can't be here." Max pushed through the gate, the hinges groaning, and padded toward the tree. He sat beneath it, staring up at the gnarled branches, then turned to her. His eyes shimmered again, brighter this time, and she saw it, herself, small and sunburned, laughing as she tossed a ball. Max, the old Max, bounded after it, his tail a blur, his bark ringing through the air. The image shifted, rippling like water, and she saw herself now, standing right where she was, older, tired, staring back at him. She stumbled forward, her hand outstretched, but the vision dissolved, leaving just the dog and the empty park. "Why here?" she murmured, sinking onto the bench beside the tree. The wood was cold, damp, biting through her jeans, but she didn't care. Max moved closer, resting his head on her knee, his fur warm against her skin. She ran her fingers through it, feeling the knots and the dirt, and something else, a faint tremble, like he was holding on to something he couldn't keep. She looked into his eyes, and there it was again, not just the park, not just her childhood, but a shadow of something darker. A rusted gate slamming shut, a collar snapping tight, a long, endless wait. Her throat tightened. "You've been here before, haven't you?" she said, her voice trembling. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at her like the answer was obvious. She leaned down, pressing her forehead to his, and whispered, "How did you find me?" A rustle broke the silence. Maria looked up, startled, and saw an old woman approaching, her coat frayed at the hems, a bag of breadcrumbs clutched in her hands. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes narrowing as she studied Max. "I've seen him before," she said, her voice soft, almost lost in the fog. "Years ago. He'd come here, sit right there under the tree. Always waiting." Maria straightened, wiping her eyes. "Waiting for what?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. The woman shrugged, scattering crumbs for birds that didn't come. Don't know. Someone, maybe. He'd stay for hours, then vanish. Thought he was a ghost, the way he moved. She paused, tilting her head. Looks like he found what he was looking for. Maria didn't respond, couldn't. The woman shuffled off, disappearing into the fog, and the park fell silent again. She looked down at Max, her hands shaking. Is that true? She whispered. Were you waiting for me? He didn't answer, not with words, not with a bark. But as she sat there, something caught her eye in the grass near the bench. She reached down, brushing aside the damp blades, and pulled it free, a small, weathered rubber ball, faded red and chewed at the edges. Her breath hitched. It was his. The ball she'd thrown for Max 100 times, the one she'd lost the day he disappeared. It couldn't be here, not after all these years, not in Brooklyn. But there it was, solid and real in her palm, a piece of the past that shouldn't exist. She clutched it tight, her knuckles white, and looked at him. His eyes held hers, steady and deep, and for a moment, the park flickered. The tree twisted higher, the swings creaked without wind, and the air hummed with something she couldn't name, a sound like distant laughter, like a bark carried across time. Then it was gone, and it was just them again, alone in the fog. Maria stood, her legs unsteady, the ball still in her hand. Okay, she said, her voice barely audible. Show me what's next. Max rose too, his movement slow but sure, and started walking back toward the gate. She followed, the rope dangling uselessly between them, knowing she wasn't just following a dog anymore. She was following something bigger, something that had found her, something that wouldn't let go. The subway ride to Queens felt longer than it should have, the train rattling through tunnels that seemed to stretch forever. Maria sat near the window, the rope leash coiled loosely in her lap. Max pressed against her leg on the grimy floor. The car was half empty, just a few late-morning stragglers, a woman with a grocery bag, a kid with headphones, an old man dozing against the rail. None of them looked at Max, not even a glance, and Maria wondered if they saw him at all. His warmth against her was real, solid, but there was something unreal about him too, something that made her question her own eyes. She decided to go after the park. The ball still sat heavy in her coat pocket, its chewed edges pressing into her palm every time she reached for it. She couldn't shake the old woman's words. He'd come here, always waiting, or the way Max had led her there, like he'd mapped the route in his bones. She needed answers, something concrete to anchor the strangeness swelling around her. The medallion, the scar, the park, it all pointed to a past she'd buried, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. So she looked up the shelter the woman's words had sparked in her memory. Hope Haven, a rundown place near her old neighborhood in Queens. If Max had been there, if he was her Max, someone might know. The shelter was as bleak as she'd imagined. A rusty chain-link fence sagged around a small lot, the gate crooked and creaking as she pushed it open. The building itself was squat and faded, its paint peeling in long, curling strips, the sign above the door barely legible. Max walked beside her, his steps slow but steady, his head low like he recognized the place. Maria's stomach churned as they approached, the air sharp with the smell of wet fur and bleach. A woman stepped out before Maria could knock, middle-aged, with graying hair pulled into a messy bun and a sweater frayed at the cuffs. She squinted at them, then smiled, a tired kind of warmth in her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans. Maria hesitated, the words sticking in her throat. "I found this dog," she started, gesturing to Max a couple days ago, outside my bakery in Brooklyn. "Someone told me he used to come around a park near here, said he might have been at a shelter. I thought maybe," she trailed off, unsure how to finish. "How do you ask if a dog's a ghost?" The woman, Ellen, she introduced herself, tilted her head, studying Max with a flicker of recognition. "Oh, I know this one," she said, kneeling to run a hand over his fur. He didn't flinch, just looked up at her with those deep eyes. "We called him Lucky. Showed up here a few years back, thin as a rail, with that scar on his neck. Stayed a while, then one day he was gone. Slipped out, we figured. Never knew where he went." Maria's heart skipped. "A few years," she echoed, her voice tight. "How many?" Ellen shrugged, standing up. 3, maybe 4. Hard to keep track. He wasn't young when he got here, but he's tougher than he looks." She paused, frowning. "Why? You think he's yours?" "I don't know," Maria admitted, her fingers brushing the medallion in her pocket. "He had this on him." She pulled it out, holding it up so Ellen could see the scratched letters. "Max, that was my dog's name. From when I was a kid. But that was 20 years ago. It doesn't make sense." Ellen's eyes widened, just for a second, before she masked it with a nod. "Come inside," she said, turning toward the building. "Let me show you something." The shelter's office was cramped, cluttered with stacks of paper and faded posters of missing pets. Max settled near the door, his gaze drifting to the window, while Ellen rummaged through a filing cabinet. She pulled out a thin folder, its edges yellowed, and flipped it open. "Here," she said, sliding a photo across the desk. It was grainy, taken outside the shelter, a golden retriever, thin and matted, staring straight at the camera. The scar was there, the medallion glinting faintly at his neck. "That's him. When he first showed up." Maria stared at the picture, her chest tightening. It was him, same fur, same eyes, same quiet weight in his posture. But 4 years ago? Her Max would have been old, too old, even then. She shook her head, her voice barely audible. "Was he anyone's?" "Not that we could find," Ellen said, leaning back in her chair. "No chip, no tags, just that medallion. He was sweet, though. Never barked, never fought. Just sat there, like he was waiting for someone to claim him. But no one did." She hesitated, then added, "There's something else. When we found him, that medallion had a little piece of metal stuck to it, like it had been part of something bigger. We kept it." She reached into the folder again, pulling out a small envelope. Inside was a silver fragment, worn and scratched, with a faint curve that might have once been a circle. Maria took it, her hands trembling, and fitted against the medallion. It didn't match perfectly, the years had warped them both, but the edges lined up enough to make her breath catch. "Where'd he come from?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Ellen shrugged again. "No idea. Showed up one night, scratched at the gate, till we let him in. Always seemed like he was looking for something or someone. Maybe he found you." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Maria slipped the medallion and fragment back into her pocket, her mind racing. For years. Not 20. It couldn't be her Max. And yet, the scar, the name, the park, it all fit, like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve. Back at the apartment, the day faded into a restless night. Maria couldn't sleep, the photo and Ellen's words looping through her head. She sat on the couch, Max stretched out on the rug beside her, his breathing slow and ragged. She needed something more, something to tie it all together. She got up, digging through a closet she rarely opened, and pulled out a dusty box labeled Maria, old stuff in her mother's shaky handwriting. Inside were photos, drawings, a chipped mug from a school fair, and at the bottom, a sealed envelope. Her hand shook as she tore it open. A single sheet of paper slipped out, the ink faded but legible. It was her father's writing, jagged and uneven, dated years after he'd left her life. "Maria, I don't expect you to read this, but I owe you it anyway. I was wrong about Max. He wasn't a burden, he was yours, and I took him from you. Gave him to some guy in Queens, couldn't even look at you after. I'm sorry. I hope one day he finds his way back to you. He was always stronger than I ever was. Dad." She read it again, then again, the words blurring as tears welled up. "You knew?" she whispered, looking at Max. He lifted his head, meeting her gaze, and the room shifted. The shadows on the wall stretched, twisting into shapes, her father's silhouette, hunched and angry, a little girl crying in a yard, a golden dog running through grass that wasn't there. The air hummed, low and deep, and she saw it in his eyes, not just the park, not just the shelter, but a road, endless and dark, stretching across years she couldn't count. She dropped the letter, sinking to the floor beside him. "You found me," she said, her voice breaking. "After all this time." He pressed his head against her hand, his fur warm and real, but his breath was weaker now, a faint tremor running through him. She held him close, the medallion digging into her palm, and felt the weight of it all: guilt, loss, love, lifting and breaking apart. The shadows faded, the hum stopped, and the room settled back into silence. But as she sat there, tears streaming down her face, she knew it wasn't over. Max wasn't just here to stay. He was here for something more, something she wasn't ready to face.